Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
Our intent by filing this case is that we treat the Idaho ratepayers fairly.
The Idaho Public Utilities Commission is trying to decide whether ratepayers of Washington Water Power Company ought to start paying for a nuclear power plant that's been mothballed for months now. We'll join that debate tonight. Good evening. In Moscow today, the Idaho Public Utilities Commission continued a hearing on whether Idaho customers of Washington Water Power Company, a Spokane, Washington-based utility, should help pay for the costs of a nuclear plant in Washington state that has now been mothballed for almost 2 years. Washington Water Power is the electric utility that serves many people in northern Idaho. The company is part owner of a Washington Public Power Supply System No. 3 plant located at Satsop, Washington. That plant was put on construction hold last year when the money to complete it ran out. Utility officials have been arguing that they made a good investment and a business decision when they decided to buy into the plant some years ago. And now they should be allowed an average 10% rate increase over the next decade to pay off that investment. That would amount to some $56 million in electric rate increases for Water Power's Idaho customers. This case is being closely watched across the Pacific Northwest for signals about how whoops cases like this one, cases about who pays for the whoops plants, will be decided. Tonight we'll be hearing from the power company, from the Public Utilities Commission staff, and a consumer group on this issue. Our first view of this important utility cost issue tonight comes from Washington Water Power Company. Les Bryan is the vice president of that utility in charge of power supply issues. Mr. Bryan joins us tonight, as all of our guests do, from Moscow. Mr. Bryan, tell me just briefly what you are asking for and why.
Well, I think it's important, Mark, that we kind of go back and see how this whole hearing process came about. The Washington Water Power Company did not request that these hearings begin. The hearings began last winter. In fact, it was early in 1984, at the request of the Idaho Commission. And what they asked us to do was to bring to them evidence as to why we ought to continue in the WNP No. 3 project. At that time, of course, in fact, in May of 1983, the Bonneville Power Administration had, through action on their own, shut the plant down, a plant that was under construction and was in achieving efficiencies and moving along quite well. As a result of the BPA action, the investor-owned utilities filed litigation against the supply system, against the BPA. So when the hearings began last winter, and even today, we find ourselves in a situation where the situation at WNP No. 3 is really up in the air. In my testimony in early '84, before the Idaho Commission, I indicated that it would be our preference that the Idaho Commission allow the current litigation to run its course and not take any action. As a result of that,
excuse me, just let me interrupt. Not to take any action relative to who pays for this plant or pays for what part of it has been completed, your investment in it.
Yes, because it wasn't necessary at this time. The plant is still under construction. It is still continuing along while we have litigation. There was really no need for the Commission to take any action.
Okay.
So, however, as we move through the summer months, and of course, as I indicated, the litigation has continued, what we wanted to do was to offer the Idaho Commission an option to doing nothing. And the proposal that we have brought before the Commission yesterday and today is basically another alternative for the Commission to consider. And basically, to put that option in simple terms, what we have asked is that the company's investment, what it will be as of January 1, 1985, be amortized over a 10-year period with no interest on the unamortized balance, and that go into our customers' rates, and that any costs and any risks associated with the plant beyond January 1985 be borne in total by the company's shareholders. Now, I think it's important to note that in our proposal, we are also sharing the costs invested up to the January 185 date with the customers and the shareholders. Approximately.
Okay. Excuse me, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay. Approximately 60% of the investment in the plant, including interest, will be borne by the customers, and about 40% borne by the shareholders.
Okay, let me just try in layman's terms to articulate, and correct me if I've got this wrong, what you're really doing here. You're saying that the cost that you've incurred in this plant that's been mothballed now for 2 years, that the ratepayers should right now start helping the company, the stockholders of your company, pay for that cost, despite the fact that there are some major questions about whether the plant will ever be built. Have I stated it correctly?
Well, we're presenting that as an option to the Commission doing nothing at this time and allowing us to continue in the mothball mode and pursue our litigation. Of course, we will pursue our litigation regardless of what the Commission orders. But if indeed the Commission feels that they do need to do something now at this time, we believe that the amortization, taking basically the ratepayers out of any future involvement in the plant is an option that perhaps the Commission would like to move to.
Right. Well, let me just ask you finally, Mr. Bryan, if the Commission were to do what you have suggested as an option here, that would help your company in a financial way, would it not? It would make it easier for your company.
Well, I think that's correct, Mark. Right now there is uncertainty among our investors as to the future costs and those recovery of those costs, and having the amortization and the sharing that I talked about would remove a major portion of that uncertainty and would certainly put us in a better situation than we are right now.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. The staff of the Idaho Public Utilities Commission has a somewhat different view of how this issue ought to be handled. For a view on that, we go now to Bill Drummond, a staff economist for the Idaho Public Utilities Commission. Mr. Drummond, the PUC staff position, in essence, is that none of these costs should be borne by Idaho ratepayers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Why?
Well, we don't feel that the ratepayers should recover or should allow the investors in the utility to recover all of the costs in the plant, when in fact the plant, in our estimation, will never be used and useful. Used and useful is the criterion that is used to determine whether or not the ratepayers should pay for utility investments.
So in essence, you're saying that this plant is a dead duck, a dry hole, that the ratepayers of the utility are never going to get any benefit from it, so the company just ought to absorb the bad business decision or whatever it was that they made.
That's correct.
Okay. When did this plant cease to be cost effective?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I attempted to do it in my testimony, and or at least in my search of the company's records and also of WPPSS records. I was not able to pin a specific date on that question.
That's an important question, though, because so presumably if the Commission decides to share the costs among stockholders of Washington Water Power and ratepayers, they'd have to decide at some point where you draw the cutoff as to when the plant ceased to be cost effective, right?
Well, that's true if you assume that prudence in the investment is the criterion that you want to use. I would disagree with that, saying that prudence is absolutely irrelevant in this decision. The question you should ask yourself is, what is the final result? The result is that this plant is probably not going to be built. It's not cost effective for the ratepayers now, and the ratepayers shouldn't have to pay for it. It's a risk that the investors took on, and they're the ones who should pay the consequences, just as they would be the ones who would receive the gains had it been a cost-effective plant.
But you heard Mr. Bryan just say that it would be a financial benefit to the company, obviously, to remove some of the uncertainty surrounding how this was going to be eventually taken care of.
Well, certainly, I would agree with that. I would agree that no matter how it comes out, just removing the uncertainty of being involved in a nuclear power plant is going to aid the company no matter what. A recent case in point is Pacific Power and Light, when just last year, or excuse me, at the end of last year, they decided to cease their involvement in WNP3. Basically got them out of nuclear entirely. The value of their stock increased tremendously as a result.
Okay. You heard Mr. Bryant's explanation of why this issue has been raised at this point. Do you take issue with any of that? And let me ask you for the Commission's view of why this issue has been raised at this particular time.
Well, the problem is the way utility accounting is set up. When the utility makes an investment in a new plant, prior to it actually being completed, they are allowed to accrue the short-term interest costs for the debt that they have to sell in order to build the plant, in essence. The cost of this debt they are allowed to put into rate base, that is, the shareholder investments that the ratepayers pay a rate of return on. As long as the plant is just sitting there in limbo, basically, as it is now, the clock is continuing to run. The specific term for this accounting treatment is allowance for funds used during construction, or AFUDC, so that the longer the investment sits there prior to actually coming online, the greater and greater this AFUDC pile becomes. And it became clear to the Commission, I believe, that they had to do something about it. The longer we sit on it and wait for these lawsuits to become adjudicated, which, by the way, could take many, many years, the bigger this AFUDC pile could become.
So strike now before the liability becomes perhaps even greater.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let me ask you finally, Mr. Drummond, the state legislature last year in Idaho passed something called a QIP law, construction work in progress. Why isn't this a QIP issue?
Well,
Try to make it so people like me who don't understand these things very well understand it, okay? Construction work in progress is the cost that a company incurs during the construction phase of a project, and ratepayers under this law, as I understand it, should not have to pay for those things. But this is not a QIP issue per se.
well, I've read some arguments to the contrary. I'm not sure that it is a specific QIP issue. The reason being that the utility isn't asking to earn a rate of return on an investment prior to that investment or actually becoming used and useful, if you want to use that criterion. So I don't think that it is a specific QIP issue, no.
Okay, we'll come back, sir. Thank you. Our final perspective on this tonight comes from Jim Lazar. He's a consulting economist who works out of Seattle. Mr. Lazar is representing the consumer group Idaho Fair Share in these proceedings before the Public Utilities Commission. You think, Mr. Lazar, that the PUC should grant no costs at all to Idaho customers, am I right?
Yes, that's correct. Idaho Fair Share in many ways started this proceeding off in October of 1983 when we filed testimony that showed at that time that completion of WPPS number 3 was not cost effective and was not in the interest of ratepayers. At that time, the purpose of our case was to try and blow the whistle and keep the money from being spent, that is, stop the mistake, try and bring the project to a halt in recognition that while it may have once been a good deal, it no longer was. At that time, Water Power was not asking for a specific rate hike specifically tied to WPPS 3, although it was an element in their 1983 rate hike increase.
So excuse me, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
You know, now we've come around to the very end of the proceeding, and Water Power is asking for a rate increase or asking for Idaho ratepayers to pay an extra 10%. Our purpose was to say, let's quit making the mistake, and then sometime in the future, perhaps we can come back and argue about who should pay for the mistake. We don't believe ratepayers should. stockholders are paid very handsome dividends. It's on the order of 15, 16% return on their equity investment authorized by the state commissions. In exchange for that, ratepayers are entitled to two things. First of all, they're entitled to high-quality management, to management that can hold costs down below the level that, say, a public power utility would in terms of more efficient utilization of employees, better decision-making, better planning than you might get in a public power utility where you don't pay profits. The other thing that ratepayers are entitled to for paying profits is for the investors who receive the profits to accept the risks that are associated with those investments. If the ratepayers are going to take the risks, if the ratepayers aren't going to get top management, then there's really no reason to pay the profits. We may as well have a public power utility.
So what would you like the Public Utilities Commission to rule in this case?
Well, the most important thing that's before the Commission now is it's necessary on the basis of the record that's been compiled over the last 15 months for them to say, whoops, number 3 is not cost effective. It's not cost effective for Washington Water Power. It's not cost effective for the Pacific Northwest region. Everybody's had a chance to come forward and present their studies, their evidence, and argue this out. And the project should not go forward. We have a grave risk because of the litigation that the private utilities are involved in, that Bonneville and Whoops could be forced to complete the plant, even though it's not cost effective, even though the power isn't needed, simply because there's a contract that says they have to build it. And if it's not cost effective to go forward with, it ought not to go forward. And the Commission is in a position to make that very strong statement.
Does the Commission really have that power?
The Commission has the authority to tell Washington Water Power that it will not approve any further financings to help pay for this project. Mr. Satry, the chairman of the board of Washington Water Power, testified before an arbitration panel last year that, in his opinion, he thought that the Commission probably could make them pull out altogether.
Okay. Let me ask you finally, Mr. Lazar, and then we'll open it up here for some discussion among the three of you. I'm going to suggest that a lot of members of the state legislature in Idaho who voted for that QIP law that I talked to Mr. Drummond about a moment ago thought that it would apply to this kind of a case. Shouldn't it?
Idaho Fair Share certainly believes that it should apply to this kind of a case. Washington Water Power is asking ratepayers to repay the stockholders dollar for every penny they've put into Whoops number 3. And there's no interest or return on that investment, but every dollar that they've invested, every out-of-pocket dollar. But they haven't said we're going to terminate the plant. If the plant is not terminated, canceled, brought to an end, then it's still under construction. I mean, there's only a couple of conditions a plant can be in. It can be finished, it can be under construction, or it can be abandoned. And Water Power hasn't agreed to abandon the plant in their testimony, which means it must still be under construction, because it certainly isn't finished. In our opinion, the opinion of Fair Share, if the project is under construction, ratepayers shouldn't have to pay for it under the law.
Okay. Well, let me open it up and go back to Mr. Bryan on that point and a couple of others. The company is not in any way conceding that this plant is a dry hole, right, Mr. Bryan?
That's correct. The plant is under construction. It has not been abandoned, and it is not appropriate to write this plant off. And this is basically what the gentleman to my left are saying, that the plant is abandoned, it will never be built. The company does not believe that.
Why not?
Well, because there are studies that have been made just recently, which show that the plant is cost effective, will provide benefits to the ratepayers in the Northwest region, and therefore, while it is not needed today to produce power because we are currently in a surplus position, will be needed in the early 1990s, and therefore should remain for some period of time in a slowed down construction phase, but be completed to meet our customers' requirements later. And their studies, studies that have done by others than Mr. Lazar, show that the plant is cost effective.
Well, Mr. Lazar, what do you say to that?
I think Mr. Bryan is mainly referring to the recent study by the Bonneville Power Administration. I don't agree that that study shows the plant is cost effective. There are a number of very optimistic assumptions that were made, and way in the back of the big fat book, there's what's called a sensitivity analysis. And if you include an assumption that the WPPS budget will go up some more. It always has. If you include an assumption that WPPS number 3, if it's finished, will work no better than the average nuclear plant, and make a couple of other adjustments to Bonneville's study, really to make it consistent with the studies that I've done over the last 3 years, with the study that was done for the Idaho PUC, in this case, Bonneville's own study shows that number 3 should be terminated. Washington Water Power's own study showed that while the plant, in their opinion, was cost effective prior to the mothballing, the additional costs that have now been caused by the slowing down of construction put the plant over the hill. I think that the testimony in this case, the Commission has before it the results of Bonneville's study, the results of Washington Water Power's study, the results of 2 studies that I did, one in 1983, one in 1984, and a study that was done in 1984 for the PUC staff. Bonneville was invited to come and testify. The Northwest Power Planning Council was invited to come and testify. They both declined to come and share their wisdom with the Commission. I think the Commission has to go on the basis of what's in front of it. And my own judgment is that what has been presented to them by everybody who's been involved shows that the project should not go forward.
Mr. Bryant, you want a rejoinder there?
Yes, if I could, please.
Please, go ahead.
I think it's important to note that the company's studies with respect to cost effectiveness for our customers prior to the slowdown showed that it was indeed cost effective for the Washington Water Power Company customers. Our studies showed that after the plant was slowed down, the cost effectiveness was questionable. Regional studies, even after the slowdown, showed that there were benefits on a regional basis to Northwest customers. So where we're at right now is that the company, in their litigation, has asked that to the extent that we have been damaged as a result of that slowdown, recover those from the BPA and or the supply system. So I don't know whether that clarifies the situation for you, Mark, but prior to the slowdown, prior to May 1983, our study showed that the plant was indeed cost effective for our company and our customers.
Okay. Mr. Drummond, you heard Mr. Lazar say that the Commission should just in effect say that Washington Water Power ought to be out of this plant, finished, done, forever. Does the Commission have the power to do that first, and is that really an option?
I'm not sure that they have the power to actually force the utility out of the project. What they can say is that the ratepayers will not pay for it, period. Now, that would obviously be a great incentive for the utility to get out, if they could. I'd like to go back to Mr. Bryan's point. The studies that have been done by some of the regional entities have all shown, at least, I shouldn't say all, certainly Mr. Lazar's, there's been staff testimony by Mr. Komanoff, that the project is not cost effective anymore. Other studies done by Bonneville Power Administration, the Northwest Power Planning Council, have indicated that the project is cost effective for the region. And that's a very important distinction to make, because I think that it is possible, although highly unlikely, that it is still cost effective for the region. It's certainly not cost effective anymore for the Washington ratepayers, Washington Water Power ratepayers.
So it might not be cost effective for the people on the Washington Water Power system in Idaho, but it might be when you factor it or meld it all together with all the other energy resources in the region.
It's possible. As I said, I think that's highly unlikely. I do not believe that the plan is cost effective at all anymore, period.
Should Washington Water Power have looked at some point in the past, in the early 80s, to get out of this plant, Mr. Drummond?
Oh, I believe so. In fact, the Commission suggested that very fact back in 1981, when actually this whole process started. Mr. Lazar, well, I guess you pointed to 83, but back in 1981, as a result of the company rate case, the Commission staff put in testimony suggesting that the plant was not cost effective and that the company should be out. The Commission, in its order in that case, said that they didn't want to usurp the management prerogative of the company and tell them to get out, but they put them on notice that the cost overruns after that point in time were going to be the responsibility of the company, and that the Commission was going to very, very carefully monitor these costs. And I think that this hearing is in fact the result of that.
Yeah, Mr. Bryan, how about that point? Should your company have looked to get out of this several years ago even?
Well, we continued, as the plant was under construction, to monitor the costs of the supply system, and we evaluated those costs with the cost of other resources that we had under construction. And yes, in 1981, when we received a revised budget from the supply system, it was a substantial increase, and we were concerned. After November 1980, we had discussed with others in the Northwest about the possibility of acquiring our share of WNP number 3 because, as you're aware, Mark, we have had under consideration the construction of a coal-fired plant just outside of Spokane near Creston, which we felt could be brought online in an adequate time frame to replace WNP number 3. But at the time we had executed the ownership agreement, we had made a commitment to follow this project, and the studies that were being made in the early 1980s show that the plant was still indeed cost-effective for the region, and it ought to move ahead.
Okay.
So, you know, we did continue to monitor the costs of those plants, and we felt it was appropriate that we continue in the project.
Mr. Lazar, finally, I just have a couple minutes left. Is there a chance that the Commission can compromise this in some way, that it doesn't, in a terrible way, impact ratepayers, that it protects the company, which is obviously has some liability hanging out here, and at the same time take into account the particularly bad circumstances of this entire whoops situation? Is there a way for the Commission, in other words, not to adopt entirely your position or not to adopt entirely the position that Mr. Bryan has articulated, but to find some middle ground?
Well, yes. I mean, the regulatory commissions usually find some middle ground. Very seldom do you get everything you ask for. We're optimistic that the Commission will not grant this rate increase that the company has requested. The Commission, you know, could issue, first of all, an order saying we're convinced the project should not go forward. Let's at least quit putting more money into it and quit making it a bigger problem than it already is. And then the Commission either could, on the basis of this record, or could start a new set of hearings to determine, you know, at what point should the company have blown the whistle. In 1981, I testified before the Commission as a consultant to the Idaho PUC staff on the mismanagement at Whoops. And now I'm back for Idaho Fair Share saying, you know, we came here in 1981 and said this project should be, you know, didn't look very good. And here we are 3 years and, you know, tens of millions of dollars later, and it's a much bigger problem. One thing the Commission can do is roll back the clock to 1981 and say, we, the Idaho PUC, told you in 1981 that you ought to look very seriously at getting out of this, that it didn't look very good to us.
I'm sorry.
You made the decision to go forward, and we're not going to let you collect the money you spent after that time.
I'm sorry, I've got to interrupt you there. I'm afraid we're out of time. We have not heard the last of this. The Commission's decision won't come until after Christmas, I understand. But Mr. Bryan, Mr. Drummond, and Mr. Lazar, thank you for joining us tonight in Moscow. We appreciate it very much. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.